listener production.
Hello, Sacha, Barbour, Gatt with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Today, we're doing MDMA, or at least we're talking about it, because right now, clinical trials in Australia are testing whether MDMA, or ecstasy or Molly, can do more than get people high. Researchers are testing whether pairing MDMA with therapy can offer profound breakthroughs for people's mental health.
We're seeing a 60% average reduction in symptoms. 50% of our patients so far losing the diagnosis of PTSD.
On this episode of The Briefing, we bring you part one of our exclusive two-part series on the early results of one of these trials and what they might mean for the future of mental health care in this country. Part one is coming up after today's headlines with Antoinette Lattouf. It is Tuesday, October 29.
G'day, Sacha. Hey, everyone. We begin overseas because a bunch of celebrities have come out to endorse Kamala Harris after inflammatory and racist remarks were made at Donald Trump's massive Madison Square Garden rally. So comedian Tony Hinchcliffe said this on stage at the New York event.
I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
And now, Puerto Rican stars, including Jennifer Lopez, Ricky Martin and rapper Bad Bunny, are sharing their support for the Democrats on social media. So in a post to his 18 million followers on Instagram, Ricky Martin said, "This is what they think of us. Vote for @Kamala Harris," while Lopez and Bad Bunny shared footage of Harris at one of her rallies, and that was just moments after the inflammatory comments were made.
Yeah, and interestingly as well, a Trump spokesperson came out to say Hinchcliffe's words did not reflect the former president's views or those of his campaign. Now, some context, the island nation of Puerto Rico remains a territory of the US, but it's not governed by its constitution and its citizens don't vote in American elections. But the voting bloc of Puerto Ricans within the US is important because they make up the majority of the 580,000 Latino voters who can cast a ballot. So it is interesting to see these celebs coming out and seizing on those particular comments by Hinchcliffe to try and, I guess, rally support for the Democrats. And look, quickly before we move on as well, Elon Musk was at this Madison Square Garden rally, but he's also being sued by the Philadelphia District Attorney. And this is over that giveaway that he was running where he was giving $1 million a day to a Trump voter who signed this petition that was, in support of constitutional rights like freedom of speech and the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. So they're arguing that this is trying to influence voters and that he shouldn't be allowed to do it. So they're suing him, trying to shut it down.
Yeah, well, the first thing when I came across that, I was like, surely that can't be lawful. And that's obviously now going to be tested in the courts with this Philadelphia District Attorney. But staying with the election, Joe Biden has voted early and there's footage of him. He waited in line at a Delaware poll for 40 minutes. Afterwards, he criticised Trump's Madison Square Garden rally as simply embarrassing. And he said, most of the presidential scholars I've spoken to about the single most consequential thing about a president is character. Character, Biden said for impact. And he puts that in question every time he opens his mouth.
Yep, 8 days to go, so not much longer, although then, as we know,
who knows what will happen in that time.
Gosh, it'll all just roll on afterwards. But yeah, this time next week we'll be on the eve of the US election. Back home now, pressure is mounting for former Qantas boss Albanese-Joyce to front another parliamentary inquiry, this time looking into his relationship with Anthony Albanese. This comes following the publication of extracts of an upcoming book by journalist Joe Aston called The Chairman's Lounge. In the book, it's claimed the Prime Minister and members of his family had received special treatment and at least 22 free Qantas upgrades. According to Aston's book, Albo liaised directly with Joyce for the upgrades, estimated to cost tens of thousands of dollars.
So the Coalition's Transport Minister, Bridget McKenzie, seems to be the one leading the charge for the inquiry, saying we need to understand their quid pro quo relationship and whether the benefits the PM received influenced him to protect the national carrier from competition, and namely Qatar. So Qatar Airways had a request denied by the government just last year to expand its services into Australia's 4 biggest airports. So if the inquiry is to go ahead, it's expected to examine Qantas's practice of giving free upgrades to politicians who also gained membership of the airline's exclusive Chairman's Lounge. Obviously, this becomes problematic if it impacts policy. And if it means that we deny competition to an international carrier. But just personally, I need to know how I can be compromised ethically so that I can be given access to the chairman's lounge.
I know, it's pretty exclusive. I mean, you're close. You've got a great big profile. I'm sure. Who's the current CEO of Qantas? Oh.
Give me a call.
Yeah, there you go.
Let's see what we can do.
I found it interesting though as well yesterday that politicians from all sides. So we had Barbour-Joyce, we had some of the Liberals and Labor politicians coming out to say, oh yeah, we all kind of do it. Like, it is very common for politicians to be offered access to the chairman's lounge, but also to get these upgrades. I think the question in Joe Aston's book is how close were Albo and Joyce?
If he's giving him calls directly.
Yes, and if it passes beyond going, oh, here, mate, fly business to something else, then that's the question that needs answering.
NATO has confirmed North Korean troops have been sent to Russia and deployed to the Kursk border region. You might remember we were talking about this last week after Ukraine raised the alarm about intelligence it had received, revealing Pyongyang was providing soldiers to Moscow. It was believed anywhere from 10 to 30,000 troops had been sent.
Yeah, and now NATO's Secretary-General has confirmed the deal, saying it signals a dangerous escalation in North Korea's involvement in the war in Ukraine. And the move will put more pressure on Kyiv's already exhausted and overstretched army. But the risk here is that it'll also stoke geopolitical tensions in the Korean Peninsula and the wider Indo-Pacific region, which includes Australia and Japan. Now, we tried to find some current stats before we hit record about what the death toll is in Ukraine, and it was really, really hard to find verified information. But we got from the Wall Street Journal, they cited intelligence as well as undisclosed sources that about 1 million Ukrainians and Russians have been killed or wounded since the war began.
Yeah, and the majority of those dead are soldiers on both sides, and that's followed by Ukrainian civilians. But Sacha, you did a deep dive last Wednesday about why North Korea is sending troops to fight against Ukraine. It seems like a significant escalation, no?
Yeah, well, I mean, North Korea isn't... we spoke to Dr. Keith Suter, who is an absolute expert in this area, and, North Korea has no solid allies, but we saw Vladimir Putin go over to Korea and spend time with Kim Jong-un, and there were all these bizarre photos of them in a car together smiling and laughing. So there is this developing relationship. But also the point that Dr. Suter made on the podcast last week was that these North Korean troops aren't really combat ready. They've never been in active conflict, and he thinks that, there's the risk that they'll be confronted with the realities of war and retreat and go, oh, I don't want to do this, because they've had absolutely no experience in it.
Or add to that already horrible death toll where the majority are soldiers.
And a new study of more than 6,000 Australian students has found more than 1 in 10 identify as sexually diverse. The University of Sydney has surveyed Year 8 students between 2019 and 2021, finding 12% identify as gay, bisexual, pansexual or asexual. Teens, meantime, who labelled themselves as transgender or non-binary were twice as likely to report having a disability or a mental health diagnosis.
Yes, Sacha, the authors also said that this study highlights the urgent need for more support services for adolescents in schools and in the health system, and that's to ensure inclusivity and protect against an increased risk of stigma, discrimination and violence. It's also important to point out that the proportion of teens identifying as gender diverse in this study was slightly higher than previous research, but that research was conducted in New Zealand and the United States. And the study's authors did say that there's an association between younger age and gender diversity, and that suggests that the findings could be due to the researchers surveying a younger cohort than had been previously studied.
On that, though, the proportion of young teenagers who do identify as sexually diverse seems to have stabilised, according to the authors. So it sits between this 9 to 12% range. So there aren't similar studies in Australia that specifically ask this question of this specific age group, which is why it's being compared to overseas study results. But it's really interesting to have these numbers even in a preliminary kind of study. But it's a really big sample size as well. 6,500 students is a good indication of kind of what's happening with that age group.
I can just imagine, some conservative thinkers will be like, oh, look, everybody's gay these days, and it's popular to be queer. But we didn't have research like this in previous decades. And if I think back to when I was in year 8 and how I identified, I knew that I was straight, but I didn't have much experience in that realm. I think having a monobrow and a little moustache contributed to me not having a particularly active relationship life. But I do remember that my queer friends were closeted at the time and that there was absolutely no way they could talk about their sexuality. But I think what would be fascinating is if you go back to this cohort in 10 years' time and see how people identify, particularly those who say pansexual or asexual, has their sexual appetite peaked or changed in those years. Yeah,
it's so interesting, and you're right. Like year 8 is young, but people still have a sense of who they are and they're starting to figure that out for sure. So, I think it's a really interesting study, and you're right, worth some follow-up in 10 years' time perhaps. Antoinette, thanks so much for joining us for the headlines today. Next up, we are getting into part 1 of our 2-part series looking at whether MDMA can help people deal with severe mental health issues.
Open your mind. Open your mind.
What comes to mind when I say MDMA? You might be thinking party drug, illegal, fun, festivals, overdose. Whatever first comes to mind, it's probably not medicine. But a growing body of research suggests that drugs that are very much illegal in Australia, including MDMA, LSD, and the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, psilocybin, can be used to dramatically improve mental health conditions where other treatments have failed. Today, exclusively on The Briefing, we hear from the clinicians in Western Australia testing whether MDMA-assisted therapy can cure treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. My co-host, Bension Siebert, is here to talk us through the early results. Bension, thanks so much for joining us today. Where did this idea of using MDMA to treat mental illness actually come from?
Well, one of the well-known effects of MDMA is kind of like increased empathy for yourself and others, talking more freely and honestly, having more trust, that kind of thing. So the idea is that in a therapeutic session, this can help people be more trusting of the therapist and themselves, I suppose. We know that some psychiatrists in the US were actually giving their patients MDMA during therapy sessions in the 1970s, and this was before it was made an illegal drug. Now, eventually, MDMA made it out of the therapy room and into raves and dance parties in New York and elsewhere. And the US government made MDMA illegal in 1985. Australia followed a couple of years later. And since Prohibition, it's been very difficult for clinicians to research what this drug could potentially do for people's mental health. It's only been in the past couple of years, certainly in Australia, where we've started to see the relaxing of the law that's allowed renewed attempts to test MDMA for this specific purpose. And as you mentioned, we at The Briefing are getting an exclusive look into how one of these clinical trials is going.
Yeah, so talk us through it. What sort of patients are being treated in the Australian trial?
So this is a trial at the Pax Centre in Western Australia, and this is for patients with post-traumatic stress disorder where other typical treatments or medications have failed. Since they completed the trial, they've moved on to providing MDMA-assisted therapy as part of a treatment program that's ongoing at the clinic. So the way that it works is that it's a 12-week program. People are given MDMA in the treatment room and they undergo psychological therapy before, during and after.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is like, how does it actually work in practice? So do they just sit down and they're given a tablet and it's away you go?
What happens is that it happens in the treatment room and you have to meet a whole bunch of particular criteria. So you have to have had 2 conventional treatments first, like 2 kinds of psychotherapy or 2 kinds of medical treatment. So this extremely pure MDMA is given to patients in a very controlled environment on the day by an authorised prescriber. That person has to be a psychiatrist. And it's not just one therapy session either. We are talking about months of intensive therapy. And the clinicians that I spoke to said that the MDMA is absolutely part of the treatment, but it's only a part. And it's called MDMA-assisted therapy because the drug is assisting the therapy. Let's hear from psychotherapist Kullack.
When someone's going through MDMA-assisted therapy, it's actually a program that lasts 3 to 4 months in duration, and there's over 90 hours of clinical time involvement. A lot of bespoke psychotherapy that's delivered by MDMA-assisted therapists and delivered by the dyad of therapists that have been specifically allocated to that client. They're closely monitored the whole time by a psychiatrist. And really importantly, it's conducted in a safe, controlled therapeutic environment that's been specifically designed to be a sanctuary for deep healing.
Okay, so what is the MDMA actually doing to people's brains during this therapy that can then open them up to, further assistance through, traditional methods like psychotherapy?
So this is really interesting on a scientific level. Let's hear from consultant psychiatrist Dr. John Laugharne.
Obviously, some people with PTSD do well with standard psychotherapy. Therapies like EMDR and trauma-focused cognitive behavioural therapies. But some of our patients get very stuck with the ability to face their traumas and work through them. So MDMA seems to calm down that fear centre in the brain that drives that sort of fear and avoidance and brings online the more thinking part of the brain. So it enables people to take new perspectives, to work through traumas and their implications in the dosing sessions and beyond the dosing sessions.
I did also ask the clinicians whether there were any side effects from the medication aside from this increased empathy and emotional openness. They said there were some minor physical effects, such as the jaw clenching that people who might have taken MDMA recreationally might be familiar with. There might be a bit of nausea, mildly raised blood pressure, temperature, but nothing particularly dangerous from a medical perspective. At least that's what's happened so far. Interestingly, another common experience that people who've taken MDMA recreationally know as the come down, where you might feel sort of depressed a couple of days after taking it, there's no sign of the come down in this clinical trial, which suggests that the come down may actually be from things that are added to a cap that's bought on the street rather than from the MDMA itself. And the effect of the MDMA in this clinical trial, he said it just doesn't wear off after a couple of days. Here's John again.
What we know from the research and the brain research is that there's a neuroplastic window after a dosing session, which goes for several days, maybe up to a week. The brain is actually becoming more plastic, more malleable, and that ties in with this idea of people taking new perspectives, things that they need to learn to make growth, personal growth, landing in a way that things couldn't land before.
So obviously MDMA is very much illegal in Australia. How has this clinical trial gotten approval?
So earlier last year, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is the agency that decides on this kind of thing, decided to make MDMA, along with psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, legal for the treatment of PTSD, as well as the treatment of treatment-resistant depression. That decision came into effect in July last year. Now, only psychiatrists who've been made authorised prescribers can give it to people, and it's in this very highly controlled medical setting. The TGA did also make the point of acknowledging that this decision was in part because there is just not many good options for people who have long-term mental health conditions, including PTSD and depression, where other treatments just haven't worked.
Look, it sounds very stringent and very closely monitored, obviously, but I guess the question still remains if there's this risk that people could try and get access to the clinical trials who maybe just want to take some MDMA. Like, how are they weeding those people out?
Yeah, well, we're still very far from the point where you can buy extremely pure pharmacy-grade MDMA from a chemist. This is not that. This is clinical trials where explicitly it's no healthy volunteers. Strict criteria also apply to people now getting MDMA-assisted therapy at the Pax Centre since the initial trial concluded.
So the TGA have set up some quite tight governance around this treatment. You're not able to just prescribe the MDMA. And so if you're a patient or a client of a service like ours, you don't take the medicine home, the MDMA home. It's prescribed and administered on site in the clinic. And so you spend the whole day there with 2 therapists and an authorised prescriber.
Okay, so you get the clearance to join this clinical trial and we've heard about like how long it takes and what it looks like, but What does the treatment actually feel like for people going through it?
Well, basically, they try and make these sessions very comfortable and very relaxing. There's specific music playing, there's comfy furniture. The clinicians I spoke to described the setting as a sanctuary specifically designed for deep healing.
Very relaxing chairs for the therapists. We have a sort of couch bed for the client because at times during the day, the client will lie down, put on headphones, listen to music. We have music going the whole day, which has been curated specifically for this kind of work. We have lower level lighting, so it's relaxed. You're spending the whole day together, the two therapists and the client. And so you're going to be going in and out of quiet phases, much more active, talkative phases of the day. The way we've set things up, the music is in the room and the volume can be controlled. The client can put on eye shades if they want to have a really quiet space and lie back and go inside. And often they'll be encouraged to go inside and see what processes are happening for them. The music was actually designed by someone who did his PhD on designing music for psychedelic therapy at Imperial College in London.
Now, on the days that the drugs are taken, it's an 80 milligram dose at the beginning of the day and then an optional 40 milligrams 2 hours in. And meanwhile, there's all this therapy going on.
I guess the next question then is, how much does it cost?
The patients involved in the clinical trial paid nothing because it was a sponsored trial. Now, though, the patients receiving this kind of therapy at the Pax Centre are paying quite a lot. This kind of blew me away, actually. Patients pay $30,000 for this treatment.
Hey, that's a lot.
It is a lot of money. But Claire and John told me this is not because they're giving people incredibly powerful MDMA that's so expensive to make. It's basically because there's a whole lot of treatment over a whole lot of time.
On a dosing day, you have two therapists in the room with you for the whole 8-hour day. So 16 hours of therapist time, and you've got the authorised prescriber in the building supervising the day. So you've got 3 clinicians there the whole day looking after you. And that happens 3 times in a standard treatment course. And then you've got all the integration sessions. So it's about 90 hours of clinician time. That's where the cost comes from. The actual drug cost is relatively low.
We are in conversations and discussions with third parties, and we're really hopeful that in the future that this is something that is going to be more available to everybody. We know that often the most complex PTSD clients are the ones who need it the most, and because they can't work, they can't afford it. I think it's really important because I just saw you raise your eyebrows when I said the cost, but I think what's important, for that just under $30,000, you're getting that 90 hours of clinical time. That's psychiatrist involvement. We have this really highly skilled and experienced team of trauma-focused therapists, including the cost of the medicine. And we follow our clients all the way up to 12 months after they've completed the MDMA-assisted therapy.
Has it been worth it for the people who have taken part so far? Like, what sort of early results are we seeing?
So whether we're talking about the people who went through the initial clinical trial or the people spending $30,000 to have this treatment since, complex PTSD can catastrophically and ongoingly undermine people's quality of life. So John and Claire argue that for their patients, it has been worth it.
It's only worth it if it really changes people and really improves their quality of life as well as their symptoms. And we are seeing that happening. And the people we're treating have tried all the standard treatments, and by definition, by the time they get to this treatment. So we're seeing a 60% average reduction in symptoms, 50% of our patients so far losing the diagnosis of PTSD. So the results do have to be good to justify this kind of input.
Seeing people go from the darkest of moments, having been in therapy for 3 or 4 years, and they're trying really hard, and we as their therapists are trying every modality and it's just not landing. And then seeing some of my clients go through MDMA-assisted therapy and they haven't been able to shower, they haven't been able to have healthy meals, they've lost contact with family members, they haven't worked for 3 years. We're now seeing people go back to work. and re-engaging in meaningful activity and repairing relationships and friendships and not drinking alcohol anymore. So you kind of go, that is so transformational. So to be a part of that, the client's doing the work. It's all them. We're just there assisting and guiding them and giving them a little bit of confidence to be able to process what they need to.
So these are obviously some very promising results, but it hasn't been completely positive or smooth sailing when clinicians have tried to test this and research this overseas. In the US, for example, there were trials where there was a placebo group, so people given a sugar pill instead of MDMA, and people pretty universally knew that they were getting a sugar pill, not MDMA, because it just doesn't feel like MDMA feels like. You don't get the euphoria, etc. The Australian trial that we've been discussing didn't have a placebo control group. It wasn't that kind of trial. But speaking generally, if you're trying to test what happens when you have the MDMA in the therapy and what happens when you don't have the MDMA in the therapy, that question is proving more difficult to research. There was also a decision by the Food and Drug Administration in the US earlier this year where they rejected MDMA for clinical trials because of concerns over increased blood pressure and heart rate and what they described as the abuse potential of MDMA. We haven't had those concerns in this Australian trial. In this afternoon's episode of The Briefing, we're going to be hearing from someone who's been through the Australian trial. Now, all of this is in the pretty early stages of development, but what the clinicians told me is that if we continue to see very positive results in clinical trials in Australia, overseas, and in the ongoing treatment programs like that happening at the Pax Centre now, it is possible that in the future this kind of treatment could be subsidised by Medicare. There's also been promising results internationally in relation to the treatment of other mental illnesses involving MDMA, and these include depression, eating disorders, addiction, autism, end-of-life anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder. The list goes on. So this is certainly an area of medicine to keep an eye on, and certainly something that we'll be updating the Briefing listeners on over time.
Yeah, it's an absolutely fascinating, I suppose, new avenue of treatment that we are looking at here in Australia. Thanks so much for talking to us about it, Bension.
Thanks.
That was The Briefing's Bension Siebert there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That is it for now. Before you go, we would love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, we're on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another ep the Savo from 3. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.